Hello and welcome. It's so good to have you join us again. Welcome to the March webinar of YBY Yeshua. I'm Amanda Achtman, and YBY Yeshua is an international, interdenominational fellowship of Jewish disciples of Jesus. We're really happy to have you here today. And as usual, we have a presentation on an important figure and a journey story from one of our members. I now invite my co-host, Jason, to introduce our speakers for today.
Well, hello, everyone. Like Amanda said, it's wonderful to have you with us. I'm Jason Moraff. I'm one of your other co-hosts. And today we have the pleasure of hearing from Professor Ephraim Radner and Dr. Richard Harvey. They will share with us today about the life and ministry of Paul Philip Levertoff. Levertoff was the great-nephew of the founder of Chabad, Chasidism. He was an Anglican priest and is regarded as one of the forerunners of the Messianic Jewish movement. Our journey story will also come from Johanan Goldman, Byzantine priest and professor of Tanakh in Freiburg. In honor of Paul Philip Levertoff, we will begin with a poem by Levertoff's daughter, the famous poet Denise Levertoff. Moments of joy. A scholar takes room on the next street, the better to concentrate on his unending work, his word, his world. His grown children feel bereft. He comes and goes while they sleep. But at times it happens a son or daughter wakes in the dark and finds him sitting at the foot of the bed in the old rocker, sleepless, in his old coat, gazing into invisible distance, but clearly there to protect, as he had always done. The child springs up and flings arms about him, presses a cheek to his temple, taking him by surprise, and exclaims, Abba, the old intimate name from the days of infancy. And the old scholar, the father, is deeply glad to be found. That's how it is, Lord, sometimes. You seek and I find. Thank you. So we will begin with Ephraim and Richard. That will be followed by our journey story, and we will conclude with a time for questions. So if you have any questions at any time during the presentations or the journal story, feel free to write them in our Q&A section. And as usual, Amanda and I will consolidate them and ask them on your behalf during that time. And at the end of our webinar today, Rabbi Dr. Mark Hinzer will provide some brief updates and announcements. So without further ado, I invite Ephraim and Richard to turn on their cameras and microphones as I introduce them. Ephraim Radner is professor of historical theology at Wycliffe College in Toronto. He is a member of both the International Coordinating Committee and the Theological Commission of YBY Yeshua. Dr. Richard Harvey is a senior researcher with Jews for Jesus and teaches at All Nations College in the UK. Both are familiar faces who have shared with us before, so please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks, Jason and Amanda. So I'm going to begin with some brief details of Paul Philip Levertoff's life, and my friend and colleague Ephraim is going to comment more on his theological ideas, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of useful and fruitful material to discuss. Can you see my screen okay and my PowerPoint? Just give me a thumbs up if you can, or say yes. I'll assume you can. I want to talk about Paul Levertoff, who Yaakov Ariel called the patriarch of Jewish Christian writers, and this is a portrait of him. Actually, it's in the National Portrait Gallery in London in the UK, so a nice professional photo. Now, Paul Levertoff was actually born Feivel Levertoff, the Yiddish for Phoebus or possibly for Pavel, Paul. And we wanted to look at how he became Paul Philip Levertoff, something about his work as a translator, a writer and a mystic, his ideas on the Hebrew Christian Church and its liturgy, his involvement in rescuing Mishling, that's Jewish background Christians from the Holocaust, and talk about his ongoing life and ministry. He was really a dancer. He danced Hasidic dances all his life. So he was actually tracing his ancestry from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of the Lubavitch dynasty, and he often claimed this direct descent through one of Shneur Zalman's daughters. Zalman wrote the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch Harav, and was the founding rabbi of the Lubavitch sect. So Levertoff always had a great sympathy and similarity in many of his views with Hasidism. How did he become Paul Philip? Well, he was born in 1878, and as a young child who was studying in Jewish school, he found a scrap of the Hebrew New Testament lying on the ground. It was actually the passage in Luke 2, verses 46 and 47, where Jesus is found speaking to the teachers and the scribes in the synagogue as a young boy. And he took this home to his father, and his father was very angry with him and very angry for finding this passage from the New Testament and forbade him to have anything to do with it. Now, if you know anything about a young precocious Jewish boy, he's going to start looking at it straight away. And although he was studying in the very prestigious Volozhin Yeshiva, a Litvak, strictly Orthodox yeshiva, he also was reading the New Testament in secret, in private. And then it was required that all Russian Jews had to get secular education. He was sent to Königsberg in Prussia, it was then Kaliningrad, and two friends of his who were Lutherans took him to church, and there also he found the Gospel of John in a Hebrew translation, and he just enjoyed it because it resonated with his previous mystical understanding that he'd had from his Hasidic background. He got baptized as a disciple of Jesus, took the name Paul, that most passionate of theologians, and Philip, that most passionate of evangelists. His family threw him out of the home. He had to leave. And in fact, he left very early on, and he joined what was then the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. Bit of a mouthful, very Anglican society. He spoke and translated lots of languages. He spoke Yiddish, Russian, Hebrew, Aramaic. He even went to visit Palestine to improve his spoken Aramaic, German, Greek and English, and he joined the Anglican ministry. He then moved on in 1901 to the Hebrew Christian Testimony to Israel, and that picture shows some of his colleagues there, Landsman and Feinsilber. He worked with him in Constantinople. He edited their magazine in Hebrew and in Yiddish, Edut LeYisrael, Statute to Israel, and The Way, the Vega. And he started writing immediately. He wrote Life of Jesus in 1904, which challenged Joseph Klausner to write his own Jesus of Nazareth, because he was really quite envious of Levertoff's own scholarship. He translated St. Augustine's Confessions into Hebrew in 1906. And in 1911, he married a fiery Welsh lady that was also a teacher with the Anglican mission to the Jews in Constantinople, Beatrice Spooner Jones. So two interesting characters, a Jew and a Welsh woman, then eventually come to England. But he's also, and we're hearing about what's happening in Ukraine right now, he was a refugee from the First World War, and he took refuge in Leipzig in Germany, and he was teaching at the Institutum Judaicum, where his first daughter, Olga Levertoff, was born, who would carry on much of his work. He's writing, publishing, and then he comes in England in 1918. He becomes a librarian, and he's training for the Anglican ministry, Anglican ordination, and he works in the library of former Prime Minister Gladstone as a scholar. But then he comes to London, and he starts the East London Fund for the Jews in Shoreditch, a Jewish immigrant community in London. His daughter Denise Levertoff, the famous American poet, is born, and he's involved in the early years with the formation of the International Hebrew Christian Alliance, and he's on the Hebrew Christian Church Commission to put forward articles of belief and a constitution for what we would now call the Messianic Jewish Alliance or congregation. He's on the committee that puts that together. He continues his ministry in the 1920s onwards in the UK. According to one report, 4,000 people attend a debate he has with a Jewish scholar, Myers. He publishes an amazing liturgy, which is a combination of Hasidic worship, a Hasidic love fest, if you like, and the Anglican communion service of the Church of England. And it's called The Meal of the Holy King, a Hebrew Christian liturgy in Hebrew, Yiddish, English, Latin. It was very popular. He had a group of Jewish believers in Jesus, Jewish followers of Jesus, visiting regularly, including Hans Herzl, the son of Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist vision, if you like. And he was great friends with many Jewish intellectuals like Sholem Asch, and the chief rabbi was a very regular visitor at his home in East London. He writes and publishes, and his work is still available today, particularly through First Fruits of Zion, who've republished some of his work. And this Hebrew Christian Church Commission was, I think, the basis for our Messianic congregations today. Hans Herzl there and his father Theodor Herzl visited and took part in that liturgy. And then I just wanted to mention briefly before I hand over to Ephraim that he was very practical in his ministry as well, not just an ivory tower academic, but he got involved in the rescuing of 10 Mischling mixed race boys in Germany, and they were so grateful. They were indebted to him for the rest of their lives, and they paid for the upkeep of his grave when he died. Olga Levertoff continued of ministry and wrote a book called The Wailing Wall, which really puts forward Paul's idea of a Hebrew Christian community, not just a church, but a whole Messianic Jewish community, if you like. And Denise Levertoff, perhaps the best known of the family, because she's a very well-known American poet who had some similar ideas to Paul, but went in her own direction. So I end with this poem, which was written by his daughter Olga, about the life of Paul and his love of Jesus, Yeshua Messiah, and his Hasidic origin. My father danced a Hasidic dance the day before he died. His daughters, they were far away. His wife was by his side. He danced for Jesus, his Messiah, who rose up from the dead and left the tomb for the upper room, and was known in the breaking of bread. Except you become as a little child, my kingdom you shall not see. So he danced in his joy as he did when a boy, and as often he danced for me. He danced for those he left long ago, and for those he never knew, for an end of strife, for eternal life, for behold, I shall make all things new. My father danced a Hasidic dance, and sang with his latest breath, the dance of peace it will never cease, till life has conquered death. My father danced, and then he died, and his name is a long time gone. His voice was stilled, and his task fulfilled, for a people that shall be on. So I hand over now to my dear friend Ephraim Radner. That's his home, by the way, and I'm petitioning for a plaque to be set up for both him and his daughter.
Unmute Ephraim. Ephraim, unmute there.
There we go. Is that better? A wonderful presentation, Richard. That poem by Olga and the one that Jason read at the beginning, I think, show and express something about Paul Levertoff's, it's a phrase used actually about Spinoza, but probably better for Levertoff, a God-intoxicated individual, truly somebody caught up. And I think that's very important, caught up with the life of God. And he tried to express that in his writing and in his ministry, truly pioneering, as Richard indicated, in some way, a unique example, not only for his time, perhaps since the early centuries of the Christian church, of self-consciously Jewish Christian theology and identity. And furthermore, something that was not just sort of theoretical, but he played it out in his ministry and the liturgy that he composed in the Hebrew Christian church. He helped lead in London and so on. That said, There are elements that went into Levertoff's views that were not all that novel, and it's helpful to put them in a little bit of context and to show what he was about. It drew on a number of strands of Christian and Jewish thinking from before his time and within his own context. And I think these strands helped support his larger vision of Jewish Christianity, raising at the same time certain questions. So I want to spend just a few moments on this. First of all, let me say something about his larger vision, what it comes down to. In a way, I think it comes down to this, very simplistically. Jewish believers in and followers of Jesus, Yeshua, as the Messiah that's written about and testified to in the New Testament and Gospels, Jewish believers represent a unique religious constituency with their own vocation right now. And what is that vocation? To purge Judaism and Christianity, both of each's mistakes and failures. It's what I call a kind of vision of double purgation. And I think it's key to understanding Levertoff's vision of Jewish Christianity. First of all, Judaism is to be purged of legalism, not of the law itself, but of a certain attitude to the law. That's the first purge. And the second one is that Christianity, meaning Gentile Christianity, the historic churches that developed, Christianity is to be purged of its, quite simply, anti-Judaism, its sensed vocation to, as his daughter Olga put it, unjew the Jew. And for Levertoff, Christianity was meant to be the fulfillment of Judaism, not in the sense of finishing it off, but of, in his daughter's own words, enabling the Jew to become more fully Jewish. And in this Jewish deepening of life and faith, therein to find a place for the Gentiles to know God truly. So it's this aim of a deeper knowing of God given in Jesus that Levertoff took up in his quite extensive mining of Jewish mystical literature, particularly from, as Richard pointed out, his own background, the Hasidic Chabad traditions that he had been raised in and that he then continued to study very widely as a baptized Jew. Some of these included, again, very simplistically, ideas about the interior reality of God's life as love, and aspects of this divine love as sacrificially ordered to the whole of and for the whole of creation, and so on. Now, some of these ideas are very complex, and Levertoff drew from a wide range of Jewish writings, which he knew intimately, and many of which were related to the Kabbalistic tradition, like the Zohar, which he helped translate into English, by the way, in a historic, famous Sansino translation in the early 20th century, for which he did not receive appropriate credit. These ideas are quite intricate, and if you're interested and patient enough, there's a wonderfully long, not wonderfully long, but a wonderful and long article by Elliot Wolfson that lays out some of this. But Levertoff was able to draw these ideas into an informing coordination. That's what he tried to do with New Testament texts, especially the Gospel of John and parts of Paul, in order to show that these seminal Christian documents of the New Testament, this was now a historical argument he made, grew out of and built upon earlier Jewish convictions regarding God's nature and promises. For instance, Jesus, Yeshua, was actually the divine Shekinah, the divine presence within the temple, for instance, who had taken material body within the world in this eschatological age. And this conviction, Levertoff argued, was completely continuous with Jewish hopes. And so he attempted to trace this in his writings. Now, as I said, a lot of this was not novel. He was a pioneer, but his ideas were not in themselves ones he made up out of thin air. For instance, the argument against Jewish legalism was, as we know, a longstanding Christian polemic. And some early writings by Levertoff in Christian missionary newsletters sound very Lutheran in this kind of law-gospel contrast. And to read Levertoff in this context is, at least for me, a bit jarring, because it sounds, frankly, a little anti-Semitic. Obviously, that's not what he was about. But it is, of course, also an argument, you see, made by many Hasidic Jewish leaders already in the movement's first era in the 18th century, something that then, of course, as we know, brought out a vigorous rebuttal, rabbinic backlash, as we know. Thus, Levertoff was able to bring together certain traditional Christian evangelical attitudes with certain traditional Hasidic ones. And that's really quite unique and very interesting. Furthermore, Levertoff's turn to Jewish Kabbalistic writings as a bridge to Christianity was also not novel. For instance, in the early 19th century, a German theologian, Catholic theologian, Josef Franz Molitor, wrote a series of very important studies of Kabbalism and Christianity, which proved very influential on later Jewish scholars like Gershom Scholem and so on. And earlier, there was the Jewish Freemason mystic, Ephraim Joseph Hirschfeld, whose writings in turn influenced Molitor. And you see, Levertoff was knowledgeable, trained in this milieu in Germany. And his joining of Jewish Kabbalism and Christianity, therefore, was not something he made up. Then coming to England, he was also immersed in a very Anglican tradition of what one could call Johannine, Gospel of John, Platonism, related to people like William Inge and others. Now, I don't think this was influential on Levertoff's ideas, but it did encourage him in his approach. And I think it's a line that deserves further research. And finally, Levertoff's historical thinking, that is to say that the New Testament outlooks grow out of an already fertile Jewish mystical context, have been taken up by other noted scholars of our day, bears resemblance critically to people like Daniel Boyarin and Margaret Barber and Elliot Wolfson, who I mentioned. Now, one of the major things that needs to be stressed in all of this is Levertoff's early and steady ongoing commitment to a missionary vocation. And it's thus hard to disentangle his intellectual interests from this missionary, or I would call better, apologetic thrust and commitment. Although he rejected the Christian church's traditional proselytizing methods, Levertoff did want his fellow Jews to see in Yeshua their longed-for Messiah and the fulfillment of their deepest yearnings and of God's promises. The damage, he thought, that had been done by the church to this hope meant that for Levertoff, remedial work, as it were, this is the purgative, purging work, needed to be done to speak to Jews at all. And I would note that on this score, his daughter Olga's writings are perhaps easier to follow and in a way more clearly illuminating of the Jewish Christian stream as it developed all the way up to our day that Levertoff obviously was so influential in. And I commend Olga Levertoff's book, The Wailing Wall, in this regard. Much of that book, as scholars have pointed out, is completely derivative from her father, and she actually quotes him word for word without actually explicitly mentioning that. But her writing is very direct, it's very challenging, whereas Paul Levertoff's writing is a little more elusive and intricate. Finally, let me note to conclude another reason why Levertoff, not just his writing style, may have been forgotten a bit in our story about Jewish Christianity. That is that the Kabbalistic or Chabad interests Levertoff had and deployed are today no longer, or at least rarely, laid out in a very clear and specific scriptural fashion. And already for some time before Levertoff took these elements up, they were, as they remain even more so today, popularly mixed up with theosophical, esoteric groups and reflections that don't have a whole lot of clear traction in common religious life. And many people have found them sort of mushy and vague and so on. And the Jewish Christian theologian Jacob Yach certainly found it that way. And he criticized Levertoff for his press and his focus upon these mystical writings. But I do wonder whether the overall vision of a double purgation of Judaism and Christianity does not, in its own way, present a kind of faith that is difficult for many believers, whether Christian or Jewish, to understand clearly, because it can seem kind of like a third religion rather than an illumination of a single revelation. I just raise that question generally. But the upshot of all of this, though, is that Levertoff's theological and intellectual legacy remains pretty much untapped to this day, unfairly. And I think it's a vocation, a very fertile one, still to be taken up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now, At this point, I would like to remind everyone to feel free to continue to submit questions, both for the portion that just took place and for the journey story that is about to be shared. Now I'd like to invite Johanan Goldman to turn on his screen and microphone as we welcome him.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Well, I have to...
I'm just going to make a short introduction of you, and then you can take it away.
Yes, excuse me.
If you'd like.
That's okay.
Sure. So Johanan was born in 1952 in Tiberias, and to French Ashkenazi Jewish parents. He grew up in France, served in the IDF, and spent 2 years as a student in an Orthodox yeshiva in Strasbourg. Ordained a Byzantine priest, Johanan holds a Catholic master's in theology, a doctorate in Tanakh, and currently serves as university professor of Tanakh in Freiburg. So thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to hearing your very intriguing story.
Thank you, Amanda. As a matter of fact, I am retired now. And I have also retired from my international critical edition of the Hebrew Bible. And so I have not too much to do. Well, to summarize the lifeline in 10 minutes, you need to be concise and very fluid in the language, which I am not in English. So I will read my lines, and I hope that I will not be so prolific sometimes. Well, my grandparents, as you said, on both sides were Polish Jews with Chasidic background on the side of my father, and they had immigrated to France in the 20s. My mother, who had lost her parents in Auschwitz, came to Israel, and my father had come in 1947, to fight Israel's war of independence. So I was born there in Tiberias, as you said, in 1952. But still a baby, my father brought me back to France, which is why I am culturally and deeply culturally a French person. As a teenager, I spent a few years in a home for Jewish children, where I received an elementary Jewish education. Then, at the age of 17 in Paris, having returned to live with my father, I became active in the Betar, a Zionist youth movement in which we educated children and teenagers in the love of the Jewish people and the land of Israel. But besides this youth movement, we had political activism, fighting at the time for the freedom of the Jews of the Soviet Union and against anti-Semitic groups in the university. At the age of 21, which was the legal age of majority at the time, I made Aliyah. There, in Eretz Israel, the love of the land and communion with young nationalist religious people was a great joy. But a joy contrasting with the very secular Israeli society, as every one of you do know, which decided me to begin a more Jewish life, first in a religious kibbutz, the Eliyahu, near Bet Shean, and then in a yeshiva in Jerusalem itself. But in the meantime, the Yom Kippur War had broken out, and I had volunteered for the army. At my age, I was only obliged to have 1 year of duty. And during the army, I felt more and more the necessity of returning to the spiritual sources of Am Yisrael. As the son of the Betar, I had a kind of nationalist mysticism. So a modern army is not exactly where you find these kind of things. So toward the end of my year of duty, I returned to France and entered an Orthodox yeshiva in Strasbourg, Litvak 1. I must say that immersion in traditional Judaism is one of the true wonders that God has done in my life. There were 2 intense years of study, prayer, wonderful rabbanim, the depth of Gemara and commentators, the sanctity of Shabbat. It was a true blessing. I was reconnecting with the living memory of Israel, the living waters of the Torah. And I had some very deep spiritual experiences there. And yet, there is always a yet. Despite all these spiritual blessings, without any clear reason appearing at the time, I was still very frustrated. Something was missing, and I could not put my finger on it. This was mainly evident in the fact, for example, that religious people around me were not interested in the renewal of Israel as a nation among the nations. I used to say that the Orthodox Judaist walks on the sidewalk of history, but I still love them very much. Somehow, this was the exact opposite of what I had experienced in Eretz Israel. Here was spiritual strength coming straight from the patriarchs, but a huge gap between the fulfillment of Torah I was experiencing and the fulfillment of history I had felt in Eretz Israel. There was no actual messianism, in the yeshiva. I had hot debates with the main Rav and my fellow students on religious matters, but I could not understand the reason for my dissatisfaction. When I look back, what I simply missed then was the glory of God. Since I had entered Zionist movement at the age of 17, I knew that the humankind needed a solution. I was thinking that way. And this solution was in Israel. But I was keenly aware that our Jewish people needed royalty, kingship, that was lacking to the Jewish people at the time, in my view. Well, finally, not having a king at hand in this environment, I left the yeshiva. I left in a state of despair, having faith in God, love of Judaism, but finding myself in face of an existential void outside the community. For about 8 months, I went to live among actors and dancers in Brussels, opening many religious books, though I was under no illusion. Any other spirituality could not replace Judaism to fill my heart and my intellect. Finally, the encounter with the King of Israel happened during a vacation in Corsica at the end of July 1977. There, my friends who knew me as an Orthodox practicing Jew had a Bible with a New Testament. They were not Jews. Another religious book, so natural reflex for me was to open it. And then the miracle happened. From the very first sentences of the gospel, I was amazed to read what I had been trying to express in the yeshiva. This man, Yeshua, he was saying it clean and clear. I exclaimed, but this is what I was trying to say. This is my Judaism. And the day after, I just said this very strange sentence for a religious and nationalist Jew, this is the Lord. Don't ask me where from such a sentence could have come to me. In one moment, I had found my Judaism and kingship in Israel. What an upset. After a day of fasting and prayer in the Corsican mountains, I came back with the conviction I had to be baptized, another work of the Holy Spirit. My friends in Corsica did not want me to convert, but on my insistence, they told me about a charismatic community in the south of France. They told me there they put their hands on you and you cry and all that kind of things. I was I was not very enthusiastic for these kind of things. I certainly did not want to become a Catholic. I just wanted to be immersed. But I found a community of joyful, living people, mainly families, practicing friendship in the Lord with a very spirituality. And they became my new people. The community was my church. And they were Catholic. So I did not have to worry about the Catholic Church anymore. I was baptized under the name of Johanan. By the way, Johanan is my Baptist name, both the Baptist and the Evangelist being the patrons. On the first day of my arrival there in the community, I also met with my future wife, Teresa. She had just arrived for visiting from Barcelona. We have 5 children and 5 grandchildren. In the meantime, the community felt that I had to unify my Jewish perspective and the Christian thinking. So they sent me to study theology in Rome. And then my Jewish identity suddenly became the problem it had never been before. Beyond anti-Judaism, which is still strong in some part of the Catholic Church, and I experienced it, unfortunately, my greatest difficulty, spiritual as well as psychological, was the reading of the Tanakh by Catholic and Protestant scholars. In Switzerland, we have both very present in the university, Catholic and Protestant scholars who read the Tanakh, but not remembering the Sinai, if I may say so. They were not remembering what was the Tanakh. They were just reading the Bible. This was a huge intellectual and spiritual challenge. But happily, as Resh Lakish, one of my ton in Tiberias in the 3rd century, has said, God sends the medicine before the plague. Magdim Refuah Lamaka. Thanks to my Jewish background and the yeshiva, I knew I could not read the Tanakh as a Bible. Notwithstanding anti-Judaism and anti-Zionist stances, and reading the Bible instead of the Tanakh, I had entered another form of the Promised Land, as a matter of fact, through the vivid life of the church, the love of people, and what Catholics call the sacramental life, in a word, through the presence of the Lord Yeshua in his church. The Lord very physically present. And to this day, when I celebrate a Byzantine liturgy or a mass or practice confession, Yeshua manifests himself with great authority and power, as well as when I join with Pentecostal friends in praise of the Lord. In fact, I experienced in the Catholic Church what I had experienced in Eretz Israel. This is strange, but here it is how it works in my head. In Eretz Israel, before the Yeshua, my Teshuvah, there was a kind of real presence of God in physical life. But next to the obliteration of the word that makes the life and memory of the Jewish people. And the same happened in the Catholic Church. Though this uncomfortable situation was mitigated by the joy of teaching among evangelical churches, among which the taste of the living word of God and the love of Israel are very alive and today. To conclude this brief sketch, I have found myself at home, and this is, I think, the most important I have to tell you today. I have found myself at home with Orthodox, I know Archbishop in Russia, with Orthodox, evangelicals, Catholics, Anglicans, and many others. I feel at home because wherever Yeshua is at home, I know I am at home too. And through Torah, Siddur, keeping Shabbat, because I have come back to Judaism, to practicing the Judaism, and an unconditional love of my Haredim brothers and sisters, I am still clearly part of Am Israel. And this leads me to the following conclusion, which is, I guess, very in tune with Yachad Yeshua. The unity of the body of Messiah has its source in the Jewish people. And I don't mean the Messianic Jews only, but the Klal Israel, the whole people of Israel. This is what I wanted to share to you today.
Thank you so much, Johanan. That was a wonderful journey story that you shared with us, and I hope it raises some wonderful questions. So at this time, we will now begin our Q&A session. As questions continue to arise, feel free to continue to add them. Amanda and I will do our best to consolidate and ask them all on your behalf. So at this time, I'd like to invite all of our speakers, Ephraim, Richard, Johanan, to turn their cameras back on so we can engage in this Q&A. So our first question is about Paul Philip Levertoff, so for Richard and Ephraim. Could you say something about Levertoff's relationship to and affinity for the Russian Orthodox exiles in Paris?
Yeah. Shall I start just by saying that we haven't mentioned a very key figure who is a Russian Orthodox priest who was a great friend of Paul Levertoff called Lev Gillet, or Gillet, Gillet. And Lev Gillet was somebody who connected Paul Levertoff and his group in London, which was, if you like, Anglican and Hebrew Christian, with the Russian Orthodox Church groups in Paris, particularly, where Sergius Bulgakov, a famous Orthodox theologian, Maria Skobtsova, who gave her life saving Jewish people from the Holocaust, and others. Now, there's a biography by Elizabeth Bear Siegel on the life of Lev Gillet, but I think what Lev Gillet saw in Levertoff was an ecclesiology, a body of Jewish believers in Yeshua who were part of the whole universal church, which for him included Catholic and Orthodox. And we do know that Levertoff was in contact with Russian intellectuals as well. I don't know exactly how much contact he had with Bulgakov, but certainly Lev Shilei, in his book Communion in the Messiah, links Levertoff's ideas very closely with this group in France, in the Russian Orthodox exile community there. So that's all I can say at the moment.
I would just add from a theological viewpoint, and something Johanan mentioned in his own story, the sacramental character of, the way Levertoff thought of communion in the Messiah, to use Gillet's phrase, was something that had a deep resonance with sacramentality in Catholic traditions and Orthodox traditions. So it wasn't a surprise that Gillet responded and resonated with things that Levertoff was talking about. But Levertoff got this really from his Hasidic environment and understanding and reading of the Kabbalistic masters and so on, the presence of God within the universe in which a believer could actually go into the heart of God, go into it, be drawn into it and live within it. So I just want to stress that sacramentality aspect, which I think allowed Levertoff to be responded to positively by a range of ecclesial realities, lives, as well as on the Christian side, as well as on the Jewish Hasidic side.
Thank you for that. Okay, Ephraim, we have a question. Someone is asking if you could please comment a bit further on the necessity of the purgation of legalism and what you understand this to mean, the purgation of legalism within Judaism. So maybe just elaborate on that point.
Okay, let me just read something from Levertoff. So this is a quote from Levertoff. I think it's from the Love in the Messianic Age. The love of man to God, which comes from the keeping of the law, is a love which proceeds from the outer side of the heart. Now, this outer inner is a big aspect of his thinking, if you will, from the Hasidic tradition. But the love, now that's the contrast. You've got the outer side of love, of the outer heart. In contrast, as he puts it, now I'm quoting again, but the love which the repentant sinner feels for God comes from within the heart. The sin-forgiving love of God is said to come from the will of all wills. That is, from the innermost sphere of God's heart, which is above his will that is revealed in the law. This will of wills will be perfectly manifested in Messianic times, unquote. So he has this idea that the law is a way, it's meant to be a way into God's innermost being. But one gets to that only through God's own self-giving in the Messiah at the end of the ages. And this is who Yeshua is. He draws us from the outer into the inner. But of course, if one is stuck on the outer, one doesn't get into the inner. And that's the legalism issue. He's trying to break open. And in this, he thinks he's being completely faithful to the tradition he grew up in, the Hasidic Chabad tradition, but the issue is timing. Now is the time, the Messianic age in which God has given himself his own presence to open up, if you will, a believer's heart into his own heart. So legalism, it's not pride, it's not this enormous sin and so on. It's a barrier which you can get stuck at. And that's the way he seems to approach this notion. It's to sort of get from the outer to the inner. Those are the images that he uses. I'm not sure that helps the question, clarify the question totally, but it's the way he approaches it.
Thank you. I think that's helpful and I know it's given me a lot to think about. So our next question is for Johanan. What kind of connection do you perceive, if any, between the Byzantine liturgy and the Jewish mystical / liturgical tradition? Johanan, don't forget to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I had a lot to say about the double purgation mentioned by Ephraim, because I think it's very important, but I will try to I am not sure, you know, the Byzantine, or should you say in English Byzantine liturgy or Byzantine liturgy is very close to the Torah, the way the Torah, the Tanakh sees the things. There is a kind of, well, it's difficult for me to answer because, you know, for 10 years, I have also celebrated the Roman Catholic Mass because I have the authorization of the bishop to do so. So, and twice or thrice a week, I celebrated the Roman Catholic Mass with 70 young people. It was nice. And the problem for me to answer the question is that this was, I have been baptized in a Greek Catholic church. Well, I have been registered in a Greek Catholic church, the Melkite Church. And so my education was Byzantine from the beginning as a Christian. So I feel at ease. I feel when I celebrate, I celebrate only once a month now, but I feel at home, you know. So when I celebrated the Roman Catholic Mass, it was very strange for me because I felt totally not at home, but totally in the Lord and in great communion with people and with the true presence of Mashiach in his body. So maybe I am too conditioned by the Byzantine spirituality to say why it is because formally it is not nearer to the Judaism than the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Mass. So, but maybe right now, the way the Roman Catholic celebrates and the Byzantine celebrate, the difference is mainly in the fact that when you celebrate the Byzantine liturgy, you just enter into eternity. You just take your time. You have a lot of incense. And you know, in the parashiot now we have a lot of incense in Vayikra, and you enter into a kind of I used to say that the Byzantine liturgy is just going to heaven and celebrate with the angels. When the priest enters with the Gospels, with the evangels into the sanctuary, he asks the angels to come with him and to co-celebrate with him. And conversely, in the Roman Catholic, it's the opposite. Well, we in the Byzantine we had the heaven descending on earth, and in the Roman Catholic we are presenting the earth and elevating the earth to our God. You know, there are these words, the fruit of the earth, etc. So, but I always said to my students, to my Catholics and other students, that this is not my home. Well, this is my home only because of Yeshua, and through Yeshua I am near to all these people. Much more than I would be near to a Chasid in Jerusalem. But this is not my home. My home is Judaism, is Chasidim, is, you know, so it's very strange, this experience, but it's also good because it obliged me to have this double purgation that you spoke of, Ephraim. And just, if you allow me to add a little word about legalism. What I discovered when I came back to Judaism 2.5 years ago, the Lord asked me to come back. First, when I converted, I was very nationalist Jew, and the Lord told me explicitly, you have to know the church and deeply. And so after 40 years, he just said me, well, no, you come back. So this is my situation. And I have been at home everywhere, as I said, and maybe people always received me because they felt that I was at home with Orthodox, with evangelicals, with Anglicans. I know the chief of the Anglican Church, etc., archbishops in Orthodoxy. I feel at home, and because Yeshua is there. So, but when I am in Israel among Chasidim, I also feel at home because I know that Yeshua is mysteriously there too. And regarding the legalism, we always say in the church, you know, the legalism of Judaism, and there is legalism. Problem is that there is as much legalism in the churches as there is in Judaism, you know, and we have there too, we have a double purgation because the problem is the way that the Rabbanim has understood the Torah. They have made it legalist, they have made it something fixed, something they wanted to fix more and more. Not totally, but more or less. And by reaction, Christianity has done the same. This is a law. This is a nomos. This is a lex. And they are both totally wrong. And we are Messianic Jews, we have to recover what is Torah. And I will finish with that. Excuse me, I am a little long, but Torah is my main thing in my life. Torah is, as I always say to my Chevruta, Karl Kinbach, Torah is the halacha in the true meaning of the word. It's a walk. It's a walk with God. And God is not telling you, you go there and I will join with you there. I will wait for you there. I go with you. Like I went with Abraham when I told him to go. So Torah is a halacha, is a life. And as soon as you make it something you want to fix, you are legalist. And there is a lot of legalists in the churches. I remember a priest telling me once, well, the Talmud is satanic. And I told him, you know, we, with the Torah, which is rather complex, we have made the Talmud. But you, with the gospel, you have made the canonic law, which is incredible thing. So I think that legalist is always trying to put its hand on us, and we have to keep free from legalism. You have to rediscover Torah as a true life, a true freedom from God. So all the Torah is in the Aseret Advarim, the 10 words. And the 10 words are in the first verse. By the way, only the Pharisaic, the so-called Pharisaic movement has the first verse of the Decalogue. It's Anochi Adonai Elohecha Asher Hotzetzecha Miretz Mitzrayim Mibeit Avadim. I am the Lord your God. And all the Torah is summed up in this word, in this
Thank you, Johanan. I really appreciate this, and I want to give the others a chance to comment on maybe one last question as we come to a close here. Maybe I can weave a couple questions together, and whoever would like to pick up on it is free in just a moment or two. And they're wide questions, but what factors could help bridge the divide between Messianic Jews and Jews who identify more with Christians and with Christianity? And how can the mysticism of Levertoff enrich, let's say, our community of Yachad Yeshua and those across the spectrum? So in a minute, each of you might say a word about that.
Richard, you go first.
Yeah, well, the mysticism of Levertoff was something that flowed through his very being, his pores, his sitz im Leben. He was just brought up with this and he never lost it. So I think he's a wonderful role model for all of us. Not all of us have the depth of knowledge. In fact, most of us don't have his depth of knowledge and experience. But I think he modeled how to be truly a Jewish follower of Rabbi Yeshua. And he had an integrity in his life, and he had a character that was loved. And I didn't have time to mention, but he was a founding member of the London Society of Christians and Jews. He was a regular entertainer of the chief rabbi, Rabbi Moses Gaster, who was a good friend of his. And he was accepted by and large, although he was still seen as something of an apostate, but he was well loved and accepted by many Jewish people, as well as a respected teacher in the church, given a Lambeth Doctor of Divinity award by the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Thank you. Ephraim, would you like to say a word on this?
Yeah, I mean, Levertoff was this wonderful example. And by the way, Johanan, you seem to be you seem to be at one with him in so many ways that I can tell. But all these elements that have come up that Levertoff was able to not so much hold together, but inhabit, and that's a key word: sacrament, feast, dance, Torah, prayer. He inhabited them all because these were the places where God's own life was given. So it strikes me that that is an example in a way, or an invitation for Jewish Christians from various strands to take seriously, not to shut down, you see, and going back to Johanan's, or whether he said it or I, the sort of shutting down that legalism represents, but an opening up where God can come to us in these places in which we share his life in Yeshua broadly, richly. I think that's one of his great invitations and motivations that he offers us. Sacrament, feast, dance, Torah, prayer. We don't shut these down. We have to find our ways of various. We've come to our faith from various places and directions, but not to stay there. We have to live in the Lord together in all these ways. I would say that.
Thank you.
If I may, I will be very brief this time. I think I agree with Ephraim. You know, for a Hasidic world, mitzvah is sacramental. Mitzvah are sacramental.
Great. This is an excellent point to end on. And so thank you once again to all of you for being with us. And I'd like to just mention that the Yachad B'Yeshua website is yachad-beyeshua.org. There you can find blog resources, links to the past webinars, an overview. So be sure to check it out and subscribe to receive updates. If you want to share it with others, they can subscribe there. And if you are appreciating these events and want to support the work, you can also donate online there as well. The next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, April 13th at the same time slot. And it will be slightly different from our usual webinars in structure. So Dr. Rabbi Mark Kinzer will be able to share a little bit about that and to end with closing announcements and prayer. So I turn it over to Mark Kinzer.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks to all of our presenters. Truly very inspiring session. As Amanda said, our April 13th webinar is going to be a bit of a departure from our series on major figures in the history of Jewish disciples of Yeshua. It's going to be led by the Yachad B'Yeshua Theological Commission, and will focus on the various ways the Jewish disciples of Yeshua celebrate Passover and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. I'll be presenting a short historical introduction to the topic, and then we're going to have three Jewish disciples of Yeshua from three different traditions who are going to share their experience of the holiday season. This, of course, is a time of the year that's central to the life of both the Jewish people and the church, but there's also a long troubled history of the relationship of these holidays. So please plan to join us on Wednesday, April 13th, as we prepare together to celebrate the feast. And I wanted to conclude with a prayer in particular for the situation in Ukraine and in Russia. This is a bit of an adaptation of a prayer by one of our members, Rabbi Russ Resnick. Our Father and our King, in these troubled days, we pray for peace in the name of the Prince of Peace, Yeshua, our Messiah. God of grace and mercy, may your protection be upon the Ukrainian people in their time of trial, especially upon the most vulnerable, upon the countless children, elderly, and other non-combatants. Give wisdom and direction to the leaders of Ukraine as they respond to this invasion, and grant courage and success to those who defend their land. Guide other world leaders into ways of responding with appropriate force and decisiveness. Protect and strengthen those in Russia who protest the war on the streets and in their hearts, and change the mind and heart of the Russian president and lead him to repentance. May you, in your mercy, hold back the forces of chaos and violence that are mounting in our world today. Wherever there is oppression and suffering, may your spirit bring hope. Be with all who call upon your name, and enable us all as makers of peace and bearers of hope. We pray all of this through Yeshua, our Messiah, and the power of the Holy Spirit, to the glory of your holy name. May God's blessing be upon you all. Look forward to seeing you in April.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.